On a freezing December night, my son stood in the doorway of the home I had built with my own hands and pointed toward the street. "Get out of this house. I believe my wife, not you," he said, after my daughter-in-law accused me of stealing my granddaughter's $120,000 college fund. I walked away without my coat, my phone, or my heart medication. 3 hours later, the police brought him into a hospital room. After the doctor revealed what they had discovered, his face turned completely pale, and he could only whisper, "No, this can't be happening." Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here. To help grow our community, comment below with your city or country so I know where you're watching from. Also note, this story blends creative elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but the message shared is practical. I built that living room with my own 2 hands. Every plank of hardwood on that floor, every inch of crown molding along the ceiling. I measured it, cut it, nailed it down myself. 42 years ago, when Margaret and I first moved into this house in the foothills east of Sacramento, we had almost nothing. What we had was time and the willingness to build something that would last. Standing in that same room on a Friday evening in December, watching my daughter-in-law spread a manila folder across the dinner table like she was presenting a court case, I understood for the first time that something I built could be used against me. "Dad." Serena's voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of soft that isn't kindness but calculation. She slid a printed document toward me across the table. "I need you to look at this." I looked. It was a screenshot of a bank transfer request. $120,000. Lily's college fund. My granddaughter's future printed out on a piece of paper and laid in front of me like a confession. "I didn't do this," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. Serena's chin trembled. "Not much, just enough." "Your name is on the account, Dad. Your phone sent the authorization message." "Then someone used my phone." "Dad." Daniel stepped forward from the kitchen doorway where he'd been standing. My son. 42 years old, and at that moment he looked like a stranger wearing a face I'd known since the delivery room. "We found the message. It came from your phone. It said..." He stopped, pressed his jaw tight. "It said to transfer everything before I found out." "Daniel, listen to me. I've been listening." His voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear how much it cost him to hold himself together. "I've been listening for months while Serena told me things I didn't want to believe. But Dad, Lily's money. Why would she make that up?" Serena pressed her hand flat against the table and let out a breath that shook just right, just enough to look like a woman trying not to fall apart. Then she looked up at me with wet eyes and said the words she'd clearly been saving. "Dad, you can hate me all you want. I know you've never really accepted me in this family." Her voice broke and she wiped her eye with the back of her hand. "But why would you take Lily's future away from her? She's 12 years old. She's your granddaughter." My chest tightened. Not from the accusation, from the precision of it. Because she was right that I'd never fully accepted her, and she'd just weaponized that truth so cleanly that defending myself would make me look exactly like the man she was describing. "I reported a suspicious transaction to the bank 3 days ago," I said, keeping my voice level. "I was the one who flagged it." "Of course you'd say that." Daniel's eyes were red, now glassy. "Serena said you'd say that. She said the person who gets caught always claims to be the one who found it." I turned to my son directly. "Daniel, I need you to call the bank, right now. Call them and ask who initiated the fraud alert on that account." Serena cut in before he could answer. "He'll just deny it. Dad, you've been confused lately. You forgot Dr. Morrison's appointment twice. You left the stove on last week. That was not me. We're not doing this tonight. Daniel's voice dropped to something flat and final that I hadn't heard from him before. I need you to leave Dad, just for tonight, until we can figure out what happened. I stared at my son. Daniel, I don't have my phone. I don't have my coat. My heart medication is upstairs. Serena said you were planning to leave anyway. He couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. She found your passport on the nightstand. I had no words for what I felt in that moment. I'd put the passport there 3 weeks ago because I was considering whether to visit my college roommate in Arizona, a trip I'd mentioned to no one, which meant Serena had been watching my nightstand closely enough to know exactly what to do with that detail. You're making a mistake, I told him, quietly, without anger. Because anger wouldn't reach him tonight, I could see that clearly. Maybe, Daniel said, and looked away. Serena guided him gently by the shoulder toward the front door, her hand light and reassuring on his arm. A gesture so practiced, it made my stomach turn. I walked out onto the porch ahead of them, because I wasn't going to be escorted out of my own house like a man being removed from a building he'd never belonged in. The December air hit me immediately sharp and cold. At this elevation east of Sacramento, December nights don't play around. The temperature had already dropped into the upper 30s, and the wind coming off the foothills cut right through the thin flannel shirt I was wearing. I heard the deadbolt turn from inside. One clean mechanical click. 40 years of my life locked away on the other side of a door I'd hung myself. I stood on that porch for a long moment, hands at my sides, staring out at the dark driveway. My truck sat 12 feet away. My keys were inside. My phone was inside. My blood pressure medication, the small orange bottle I'd taken every morning for 22 years without missing a day inside. The porch light went out. Serena again, I was sure of it. One more small cruelty in an evening full of them. I stepped off the porch and started walking toward the road, because standing still in the cold was a luxury a 68-year-old man without his heart medication could not afford. And I thought, this is not the worst thing that has ever happened to me. Margaret's diagnosis was worse. The night she stopped recognizing my voice was worse. I have survived worse than a cold night and a locked door, but as I turned onto the road and the darkness swallowed the house behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different in a way I didn't have the right words for yet. The nearest light I knew was a convenience store just under a mile down the road. I started walking, and somewhere in the left side of my chest, something began to feel not quite right. I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't tempted, God knows I was, but because 40 years of building things had taught me one rule above all others. You don't measure twice if you're already cutting. That door was locked. Looking back at it wouldn't change the deadbolt. So I kept my eyes forward and my feet moving on the asphalt, and I let the cold do what cold does in December in the California foothills settle into everything it can reach. My flannel shirt was useless against it. The wind came in from the northeast off the ridgeline, and it didn't negotiate. Within the first 2 blocks, my fingers were stiff and my ears were burning, the kind of burn that starts sharp and then goes dull in a way that's worse than the sharpness. I counted mailboxes. It's something I used to do on job sites when the work got tedious. Count things to keep the mind from wandering into territory it couldn't fix. Mailbox 1. Mailbox 2. Mailbox 3 with the broken red flag someone had never gotten around to replacing. And somewhere between mailbox 3 and 4, Margaret's voice came back to me the way it always does when I'm in trouble. Not in a mystical way. Just the things she used to say had a habit of surfacing exactly when I needed them, like notes she'd left in coat pockets for me to find later. Raymond Calloway, she used to say, when I was being stubborn, which was often, The problem with you is that you think patience and surrender are the same thing. They're not. One is a tool, the other is a defeat. She'd have had something to say about tonight. Something I probably wouldn't have wanted to hear immediately, but would have understood by morning. We built this house together in 1987, Margaret and I. She was 31, I was 30, and we had a 2-year-old Daniel and a set of architectural drawings we'd done ourselves on graph paper because we couldn't afford a real architect. Every Saturday for 14 months, I was on site. She handed me tools through a window frame that didn't have glass in it yet and told me which measurements I'd gotten wrong. Daniel grew up in that house, learned to walk on those hardwood floors, broke his first window throwing a baseball in the backyard, and spent a week helping me replace the glass as punishment, which was also his first carpentry lesson, though I didn't tell him that was the point until he was 30. When Margaret got sick, she made me promise 2 things. The first was to keep the house safe for Lily. She said it with a quiet ferocity I hadn't heard from her since Daniel's childhood, like she could already see something coming that I couldn't. Lily's going to need something solid to stand on someday, Ray. Promise me. I promised. The second thing she asked me to promise I've never told another living person. Daniel called 8 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could hear from the first syllable that something had collapsed. Not his voice was controlled the way he got when he was working hard not to let something show. But there was a thinness to it, a careful quality that I'd learned to read over 42 years of being his father. Dad, I lost the contract. The Fresno project fell through and he stopped. In the background, I heard Lily's voice, high and distant, asking her mother something. We're in a rough spot. Serena and I were wondering if maybe just for a few months. Come home, I said, before he finished the question. Dad, we don't want to impose. Daniel, come home. The first week it felt right. Lily ran through the backyard the way Daniel used to. She helped me sweep wood shavings in the garage and asked me questions about every tool on the pegboard, and I answered every single one because that kind of curiosity should never go unanswered. Serena made dinner twice and was perfectly pleasant about it. She complimented the house. She asked me thoughtful questions about the neighborhood. And on the third day, while Daniel was at a job interview in Roseville, she stood in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard with her coffee mug in her hand, and said very casually, "This property must be worth quite a bit now, with how the foothills market has gone." I said something neutral. She smiled and moved on to another subject. But I am 68 years old, and I spent 40 of those years reading structures, reading which walls were load-bearing, and which ones were just for show, which foundations would hold, and which ones had already started settling in ways that wouldn't be obvious until the wrong season. That question wasn't curiosity. That question was a measurement. I started paying attention after that. Not loudly, not confrontationally. Confrontation teaches people to hide better, and I needed to see what she would do when she thought no one was watching. So I watched. And I started keeping track. My chest tightened again harder this time, and I slowed my pace without meaning to. The pressure sat in the center of my sternum and spread outward in a slow, heavy wave that was different from stress. I know what stress feels like. I've felt it for 40 years. This was something else. I stopped walking and pressed my hand flat against the nearest fence post, steadying myself. Ahead of me, maybe 200 yards down the road, the fluorescent lights of the Quick Mart glowed orange and white against the dark. I could see it clearly. I just needed to close that distance. I took 3 slow breaths the way Dr. Marsh had told me to when my blood pressure climbed in through the nose, hold out through the mouth. The pressure didn't lift. It shifted the way a heavy piece of furniture shifts when you try to move it alone, rearranging its weight rather than lightening it. "Come on, Ray," I said out loud to no one, to the December dark and the empty road. 200 yards. You've carried heavier loads than this." I pushed off the fence post and started walking again. The convenience store lights got closer. The pressure in my chest got heavier. And somewhere in the part of my mind that had been a builder for 40 years, a quiet voice noted with the same professional detachment I'd always used on job sites, that the timing of this particular symptom on this particular night, after weeks of medication, I now had reason to question was not a coincidence. I just needed 200 more yards. I just needed to reach the light. You want to know when I first understood something was seriously wrong? Not the night she laid that folder on my table. Not even the week Daniel lost the Fresno contract and I told him to come home without thinking twice. It was a Tuesday morning in October, 6 weeks before all of this, when I went to the mailbox and found my bank statement already opened, not torn open. Carefully, the way you do when you want to reseal something and hope nobody notices. The flap was still sticky at the corner. Whoever had opened it had tried to press it back down and almost succeeded. I stood at the end of my own driveway, holding that envelope, and a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time settled into my chest. Not panic, not anger. Something quieter than both of those. The feeling a carpenter gets when he's running his hand along a wall and his palm finds a hollow spot that shouldn't be there. Somebody was checking my walls. I didn't say a word to anyone. I went inside, made coffee, and started paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks, I cataloged everything the way I used to catalog materials on a job site, methodically, without emotion, with a craftsman's patience for detail. The key to my office moved from the left hook by the door to the right hook. Not once, 3 times each time returned before I came home, but never to exactly the same position as before. The folder holding my savings passbook sat 1 inch further back in the filing drawer than I kept it, because I always lined it up with the front edge. 3 pages inside had been photographed, I could tell, because the crease pattern was wrong, the kind of crease you get when someone presses a phone flat against a page in a hurry. And Serena, who had not once in 8 months asked me a direct question about money or property, suddenly started asking questions, casually. The way you might ask about the weather. One evening she came into the garage where I was sanding a cabinet door and leaned against the workbench with her arms folded. "I was talking to one of the neighbors today," she said, her voice light and conversational. She mentioned a house 2 streets over just sold for over $800,000. "Can you believe that? California market," I said, not looking up from the sandpaper. "It makes you wonder what this place would go for." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "I mean the lot alone at this elevation." "Serena," I said, setting the sandpaper down and looking at her directly, "if you ever want to talk about the house, we can sit down and talk about it properly." Her expression didn't flicker. She smiled warmly and said, "Oh, I'm just talking, Dad. Just thinking out loud." She picked up one of my chisels, examined the blade with mild interest, and set it back down. "That's a beautiful piece of work you're doing there." She left the garage. My jaw was tight enough to ache. That was the 3rd time she'd floated the property value question in 2 weeks, and each time she'd done it in a different room with a different lead-in, as if she were testing which approach I'd least notice. I noticed all of them. I started keeping a small notebook, a green one I'd had since Daniel was in high school, with a broken clasp on the spine. Dates times what I'd observed. I kept it in the left breast pocket of my work jacket, which I wore every day in the garage. I also kept it visible. That's the part that might seem strange. A man building a case against someone would normally hide his evidence. But I'd spent 40 years reading how structures fail, and I knew the difference between a wall that was secretly compromised and a wall that looked solid right up until you kicked it. Serena was looking for my evidence. I needed her to think she'd found it, so I let the notebook be findable. I didn't leave it in the open. I left it findable the way a careful man leaves things that he once discovered, in my work jacket. on the passenger seat of my truck, on the corner of the kitchen counter exactly once long enough for her to see it while she was clearing dishes. A week later, the notebook was gone. I was in the backyard trimming the rose bushes Margaret had planted along the fence line when I noticed the smell of faint chemical bite in the air, the unmistakable trace of paper burning. I walked around to the side of the house where the metal garden bin sat, and I could see the edge of green cardboard still smoldering at the bottom, the broken clasp curling in the heat. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then I went back to the roses, because the notebook she'd burned was full of grocery lists and cabinet measurements and nothing else. The real documentation, the bank statements, the camera card, the medication records, those were somewhere Serena would never think to look inside, something she would never think to open, hidden in a way only a man who builds secret compartments for a living would know how to hide them. I'll get to that. You'll understand when I do. What I will tell you now is that Lily knew something was in that workshop. One afternoon, she wandered in while I was standing at the shelf above my workbench, and she looked at the shelf, then at me with those quiet, dark eyes she'd inherited from her grandmother's side of the family. "Grandpa," she said carefully, "are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her. "Just organizing." She looked at the shelf one more time. Then she looked at me in a way that a 12-year-old shouldn't have to look at anyone, like she was measuring how much truth she could safely say out loud. "Okay," she said quietly, and left. But at the door, she paused and glanced back, and she gave me the smallest nod. The kind that means, "I see you. I don't understand everything, but I see you." A 12-year-old child was braver in that moment than most adults I've known. And whatever Serena had said or done to make that child afraid to speak freely in her own grandfather's house, that more than the opened envelopes or the burned notebook or the questions about property values, that was what settled something cold and certain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart medication. 3 days before she laid that folder on my table, I found out exactly how far her plan had already gone. And what I saw in my bank account made my hands go completely still. 3 days. That's how much time I had between the moment I understood what Serena had set in motion and the night she brought it to my dinner table like she'd already won. It started at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning while the coffee was still brewing and the foothills outside my kitchen window were just beginning to catch the first pale light of a December dawn. I'd made a habit over the past several weeks of checking my accounts online before the house woke up quietly on the old desktop in my office, with the door closed before Daniel's alarm went off and Serena started moving around in the kitchen below. What I found that morning made me set my coffee mug down very carefully because my hands had started to shake and I didn't want to spill it. There was a pending transfer request on Lily's college fund account. $120,000 earmarked to move to an external account number I didn't recognize. The request had been initiated 2 days earlier from my old tablet, the one I kept on the shelf in the living room, that I rarely used anymore, that anyone in the house could access if they knew my login, which they shouldn't have. But the detail that made my stomach drop wasn't the amount or even the account. It was the verification code routing. In the American banking system, when you initiate a large transfer, the bank sends a one-time confirmation code to the phone number registered on the account, a security step meant to verify you are who you say you are. My registered number was my cell phone. But the routing on this request had been quietly changed 3 weeks ago, changed to a number I didn't recognize, a prepaid line that wasn't mine. Someone had gotten into the account settings, changed the verification routing, and then initiated a transfer large enough to gut Lily's entire future. And they'd done it from a device sitting 12 feet from where we ate dinner every night. My hands were steady by the time I stood up from the desk. Not because I wasn't frightened, I was. But fear has a way of burning itself into something cleaner when you finally understand the shape of what you're dealing with. And I'd worked enough fraud investigations alongside insurance adjusters over the years to know exactly what I was looking at. I got dressed. I drove to First Valley Bank on Sunrise Avenue in Roseville before it opened and waited in the parking lot until Carol Dempsey, the branch manager I'd worked with for 12 years, unlocked the front door at 9 o'clock. "Ray," she said, surprised to see me so early. "Everything all right?" "Not entirely," I told her. "I need to talk to you somewhere quiet." We sat in her office with the blinds half drawn, and I walked her through everything I'd seen: the pending transfer, the rerouted verification number, the tablet access. Carol's expression shifted from politely attentive to professionally careful in the way experienced bankers do when a customer is telling them something they recognize. "You want to freeze it," she said. "Not a question. I want to flag the account for suspicious activity and request a hold on all outgoing transactions," I told her, "including this pending transfer. And I want it documented that the freeze came from me, the account holder, not from any automated system." "That's your right," Carol said. She was already pulling up the account on her screen. "Ray, the rerouted verification number, do you want us to report that to our fraud division?" "Yes, quietly. I don't want anything going to the secondary contact on the account." Serena had added herself as a secondary contact 3 weeks ago, claiming she needed access in case of an emergency, while Daniel and I were both unreachable. I'd agreed at the time without thinking enough about it. "Can you flag that the secondary contact does not get notified of this action?" Carol looked at me steadily. "I can do that. Ray, is there something I should know about your family situation?" "There's something I'm in the process of finding out," I said. "I'd appreciate your discretion." She gave it to me without another question, which is why I'd banked with her for 12 years. I sat in my truck in the parking lot afterward and called Margaret Harlow Megg, my attorney of 15 years, whose office was 20 minutes north in Auburn. She picked up on the second ring. "Ray, you're calling early." "I've got a situation," I said. "I need you to hold some copies of documents for me, off the record until I say otherwise." There was a short pause on her end, the pause of a woman recalibrating the category of call she'd just received. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I'm sitting in a bank parking lot at 9:15 in the morning." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Phone. Come in this afternoon," Meg said, and her tone had gone from professional pleasant to professional focused, a shift I'd learned to appreciate over 15 years. 2 o'clock. Bring everything." I spent that afternoon in Meg's office in Auburn going through every document I'd copied, every note I'd kept in the real record, the one that wasn't in any notebook Serena could find and burn. Meg sat across from me and read carefully, and when she looked up, her eyes were sharp, and her expression was controlled in the way it gets when she's working. "Do you want to confront her?" Meg asked. "Not yet." I shook my head. If I confront her now, she destroys what she hasn't already destroyed, and Daniel ends up defending her out of loyalty. I need to know how far she's willing to go. Meg looked at me for a long moment. "Ray, if she's capable of rerouting verification codes and initiating a 6-figure transfer, she's already committed wire fraud under federal law. That's not a minor offense." "I know what it is," I said. "I just need a few more days." What I didn't tell Meg, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I suspected the account wasn't the only thing Serena had been interfering with. There was something else I'd noticed, something quieter and more frightening than a bank transfer, something that had to do with the small orange bottle on my bathroom shelf that I'd taken every morning for 22 years without missing a single day. That evening, I came home to find Serena in the kitchen, her back to me, phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking quietly, too quietly, and when she heard my key in the door, she shifted toward the window and dropped her voice further, the way people do when they don't realize how much that gesture reveals. She turned around when I came in and smiled bright and immediate. "Hey, Dad, dinner's almost ready." "Thank you, Serena," I said. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. I poured myself a glass of water. I did everything a man does when he comes home to a normal evening. But I watched her hands while she stirred the pot on the stove, and I noticed they weren't quite steady. She was unsettled. She'd been waiting for something to happen with that bank account, and instead, nothing had, and the nothing was clearly louder than she'd expected. She just didn't know yet that the quiet was mine. Before I tell you what happened on that road, I need to take you back 2 weeks earlier because the most damaging thing Serena ever did to me didn't happen at the dinner table with a folder full of lies. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in November, in my own living room over a cup of coffee and a photograph of my granddaughter. That was the afternoon she got into my phone. It started the way all of Serena's best maneuvers started, with something completely natural. Something you'd never question in 1,000 ordinary days. She came into the living room while I was reading, sat down across from me, and held up her own phone with a smile that reached her eyes just the right amount. "Dad, I took some pictures of Lily at her school recital last Thursday." She said, her voice warm and easy. "She was so good. Do you want to see them on your screen? The photos look so much better on a bigger display." I set my book down. "Sure," I said. "Let me pull it up." I reached for my phone on the end table, entered my passcode, and handed it to her. Simple as that. 68 years old and 40 of them spent building things with my hands. I understood wood grain and load-bearing walls and the tensile strength of different grades of steel. What I did not think about, not even for a half second, was the biometric security settings on a smartphone. Serena took the phone with both hands, angled the screen toward herself, and started swiping through Lily's photos. She made the sounds a grandmother, a step-grandmother, though she never used that word, makes when she's looking at a child she's proud of. Little sounds of delight. Comments about Lily's dress, about the way she'd styled her hair. "Oh, that one is just perfect," she said. "Dad, can you come look at this one?" I stood up from my chair and crossed the room toward her. She held the phone up for me to see, and as I leaned in to look at the screen, she shifted it slightly in her hands. Natural. Fluid. The way you'd shift any device to share it more comfortably. I went to the kitchen to get my reading glasses from the counter because the image was small, and my eyes aren't what they were at 50. I was gone maybe 90 seconds. When I came back, Serena was still looking at photos, still smiling, and she handed the phone back to me with a warmth that felt entirely genuine. "She's growing up so fast." Serena said, her eyes a little soft at the corners. "I can't believe she's already 12. "Neither can I," said, and I sat back down with my book. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know, until I was lying in a hospital bed, weeks later, with an IV in my hand, and a whole lot of time to think, was what had happened in those 90 seconds while I was in the kitchen. Modern smartphones allow you to register multiple fingerprints. On my iPhone, buried in the settings under Face ID and passcode, there are slots for up to 5 fingerprints. Most people register 1 or 2 their own and never think about it again. Why would you? You're the only one who uses your phone. In 90 seconds, Serena had navigated to that setting, registered her right thumb, and returned to the photo gallery. She didn't need my passcode after that. She didn't need to be anywhere near me. She just needed my phone to be within reach while I was asleep. She got her chance 3 nights later. I'd had a long day, a trip to the lumberyard in Rockland, 2 hours of sanding in the garage, and an evening where my back had been complaining in the low, steady way it does when I've been on my feet too long. Serena brought me a cup of chamomile tea at 8:30, set it on the end table beside me without being asked. "You look tired, Dad," she said, genuinely kind-sounding. "You should get some rest." I thanked her. I drank the tea. I was asleep by 9:15, which was earlier than usual for me. I'm typically up until 10:30, sometimes 11. At 2 in the morning, my phone sent a message to a contact I'd never added from a number I didn't recognize as the recipient. The message read, "Transfer everything before my son finds out." I was deeply asleep when it was sent. I didn't hear the phone. I didn't feel it vibrate on the nightstand. Serena's right thumb had unlocked it. Her hands had typed those words. And in the morning, my phone showed no record of the sent message. She'd deleted it from the sent folder before she put the phone back on my nightstand. What she hadn't counted on was that the recipient, Victor Pruitt, the man she'd been talking to in hushed tones in the backyard, and the upstairs hallway for weeks, had a number that would eventually be traceable. And that bank servers don't just log the message. They log the device, the timestamp, the IP address, and the fingerprint authentication event that unlocked the phone at 2:04 in the morning. Digital evidence doesn't disappear because you delete a text. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because sitting in that living room on that Sunday afternoon, handing my phone to a woman I didn't yet fully understand, I felt nothing more than mild warmth toward a daughter-in-law who wanted to share pictures of my granddaughter. The cold came later. There's one thing I keep coming back to even now. When Serena handed my phone back, and I sat down with my book. Lily walked through the living room on her way to the kitchen. She glanced at her mother. Then she glanced at me. Her expression did something complicated, a flicker of something I couldn't name at the time, a tightening around the eyes that was too old for a 12-year-old's face. She kept walking. She didn't say anything, but I've thought about that look 100 times since. I think Lily knew something was wrong even then. I think she'd seen her mother move in that particular careful way before, and she recognized it the way children recognize things they've been taught not to name out loud. I wish I had recognized it sooner. But I was watching for the wrong things, bank statements and open envelopes and questions about property values. I wasn't watching for a Sunday afternoon and a photograph and 90 seconds in an empty room. Serena was smarter than I gave her credit for. I want to be honest about that. She planned carefully, she moved quietly, and she used the simplest tools available to her, my own trust, my own phone, my own habit of getting up to find my reading glasses. What she didn't plan for was something she'd never seen me do in 8 months of living in my house. I'll tell you what that was. But first I need to tell you about the morning, specifically about the small orange bottle on my bathroom shelf that I reached for every single day, and what I began to notice about it 3 weeks before everything came apart. I want to talk about the pills now. Not because I understood what was happening while it was happening. I didn't, not fully. But I owe it to you to be honest about every piece of this, including the piece that frightens me most when I think about how far it could have gone. For 22 years, I've taken a small white tablet every morning at 7 o'clock. Metoprolol succinate, a beta blocker that keeps my heart rate steady and my blood pressure in a range my doctor Kevin Marsh over at Sierra Vista Medical in Roseville describes as acceptable for a man my age with my history. I take it with a full glass of water before breakfast every single morning, without exception. Margaret used to say I was more reliable about that pill than I was about anything else in my life, including showing up to dinner on time. She wasn't wrong. So when I started feeling off in the mornings, a low-grade dizziness when I stood up too fast, a heaviness behind my sternum that I kept attributing to the cold weather or a poor night's sleep, I noticed. I'm not someone who ignores his body. I've worked with my hands long enough to know the difference between ordinary aches and something that's trying to tell you something. I just didn't know yet what it was trying to tell me. 3 weeks before the night Daniel locked me out, I mentioned it to Serena at breakfast. Offhand, the way you mention a minor thing. "I've been a little dizzy in the mornings lately," I said, stirring my coffee. "Might be the altitude change, or maybe I need to drink more water." Serena looked up from her phone with an expression of immediate, practiced concern. "Dad, I've been worried about that. she said, setting her phone face down on the table, a gesture that looked like she was giving me her full attention and probably was just not in the way I thought. You know, managing medication for someone your age can be tricky. Sometimes the dosage needs adjusting or the timing shifts. Would you like me to help you keep track of it? I could organize your pill case, make sure you're taking everything at the right time. I've been managing my own medication for 50 years, I told her pleasantly. I think I've got it handled. She smiled and let it go. Of course, Dad. Just let me know if you change your mind. I didn't change my mind. But 2 days later, I noticed she'd reorganized the bathroom cabinet, moved my shaving kit, straightened the towels, rearranged the shelf where I kept my prescriptions. She mentioned it at dinner as an aside. She'd done some tidying while Lily was at school. She hoped I didn't mind. I didn't accuse her of anything. I went upstairs after dinner, stood in my bathroom, and looked at the orange pill bottle on the shelf. It looked identical to how I'd left it. Same label, same child-proof cap, same position on the shelf. But I unscrewed the cap and poured 3 tablets into my palm. Now I'm not a pharmacist. I can't identify medication by sight with any certainty. But I've taken the same pill every morning for 22 years, and the tablet that sits in my palm every day has a specific weight to it, a specific slightly chalky texture when I press it between my fingers, a faint bitterness if it touches my tongue before I swallow it. The tablet in my palm that evening was smoother, slightly lighter, and when I pressed it between my fingers, it had a different resistance, softer, more powdery, the way a calcium supplement feels versus a prescription medication. My heart rate picked up. Not from fear, from the cold, clean clarity of understanding something I did not want to understand. I didn't confront her. I went back downstairs and finished the evening the way I'd finished 100 evenings in that house television, a glass of waterbed at 10:30. But the next morning, I drove to the Walgreens on Douglas Boulevard in Roseville and bought a pill identifier app and a magnifying glass. The tablets in my bottle did not have the correct imprint code for metoprolol succinate. They were magnesium glycinate, a common supplement available over-the-counter white, and approximately the same size. She'd been replacing them. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, too easy to catch. She'd been replacing them 1 or 2 at a time over days, the way you'd slowly exchange the lights in a room for slightly dimmer ones, hoping no one notices until the whole room is dark. My neighbor, Norma Briggs, had seen her do it. Norma is 65, a retired grocery store cashier who lives 2 houses down and helps me out a few hours a week vacuuming laundry, the kind of housework that piled up after Margaret passed, and that I was never particularly good at. She's a quiet woman, careful, the kind of person who notices things without announcing that she's noticed them. She told me later, much later in that hospital room, that she'd been washing the front windows of her own house on a Saturday morning in November when she happened to look across toward my kitchen window. Serena was standing at the kitchen sink, her back to the window. Norma could see her clearly, the movement of her arms, the way she was handling something small on the counter. She saw Serena take what looked like 2 bottles and transfer something from one to the other, then pour what remained in the first bottle down the drain. I thought it was odd, Norma told me, but I thought maybe she was just throwing out old vitamins or something. I didn't think. She stopped, and her voice cracked open the way voices do when a person is trying very hard to hold themselves responsible for something. I should have asked you about it right then, Ray. I should have said something. She hadn't said anything because the following Tuesday, Serena had stopped her in the driveway. Norma! Serena had said, her voice low and friendly and precise as a scalpel. I noticed that one of my grandmother's earrings is missing from the jewelry box in the bedroom. A small pearl drop. It's been in our family a long time. She paused. I'm not accusing anyone. I just want to mention it in case it turns up. Norma told me her stomach had dropped straight to the ground. She looked right at me when she said it. Norma said, her hands twisting in her lap. like she was giving me a warning wrapped up in a question. Norma had been cleaning my house for 2 years. She'd never taken so much as a paperclip. But she was 65 years old, with a part-time income and a reputation in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and she understood with perfect clarity what Serena was offering: silence in exchange for silence. She took the offer. She hated herself for it, and she had carried it around for 3 weeks like a stone in her chest. But she'd also done one thing Serena hadn't anticipated. On the morning she saw Serena at the kitchen sink, Norma had been holding her phone. She'd been texting her daughter before she started on the windows. She'd taken a picture. Not deliberately, not as evidence, just the nervous habit of someone who doesn't quite know what they're seeing and wants to remember it later. The image was blurry, taken through glass at an angle. But you could see the outline of Serena's figure, the 2 bottles on the counter, the motion of her hands. That photograph sat in Norma's camera roll for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that Norma wasn't sure would ever come. Out on that road, I didn't know any of this yet. I didn't know about Norma. I didn't know about the photograph. What I knew was that the tightness in my chest, as I walked through the December dark, was not anxiety and not cold, and not the product of a difficult evening. It was a 68-year-old heart doing its best without the help it needed. The Quick Mart sign glowed ahead of me, close enough now that I could read the red lettering. 150 yards, maybe less. My left arm went heavy. I pressed my hand flat against a wooden fence post at the edge of someone's property and told myself out loud, with the firm, deliberate tone I used on job sites when something was going wrong and panic was the one tool that never helped: "You are not going to stop here, Ray. Keep moving." But my knees had other ideas. They buckled not all the way, just enough, and I grabbed the fence post with both hands and held on, breathing through the pressure that was now spreading from my sternum outward in slow, deliberate waves. The light from the Quick Mart was right there. So close. And then my legs gave out completely, and the cold asphalt came up to meet me faster than I expected, and the last thing I saw before the world tilted sideways was the red letters of that sign blurring at the edges, like a photograph taken by someone whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. There are moments when the mind does something strange, when the body is failing and there is nothing left to do but keep moving forward. The mind stops cooperating with the present and starts pulling up the past instead, not gently, not in the organized way. You'd flip through a photo album, but in the desperate, scrambled way of someone searching every drawer at once for something they can't afford to lose. That's what happened to me on that road. My feet were still moving, one in front of the other, slow and deliberate, the way I'd taught myself to work when a job got hard. You don't think about finishing. You think about the next step, and then the one after that. But somewhere between the 4th and 5th block from the house, the darkness between the streetlights started feeling longer than it should, and my mind let go of the road entirely and took me somewhere else. It took me to a Tuesday morning in October, 2 weeks after Serena had started quietly redecorating my sense of reality. I'd come downstairs to find my car keys in the vegetable drawer of the refrigerator. Between the celery and a bag of baby carrots sitting there like I'd always kept them there, like that was a perfectly reasonable place for a set of keys. I stood in the kitchen doorway staring at them, and before I could say a single word, Serena appeared behind me with a coffee mug and a look of gentle, painful concern. "Oh, Dad," she said softly, like she'd caught me doing something heartbreaking. "This is the 3rd time this week." "I didn't put those there," I said. "I know you don't remember putting them there." She set her coffee down and touched my arm the way you'd touch the arm of someone fragile. "That's what worries me, Dad. You don't remember." Daniel came in from the garage at exactly the wrong moment, and Serena turned to him with those same worried eyes and said very quietly, as if she didn't want to embarrass me, "I found them in the fridge again." I watched my son's face do something I hated, a mixture of pain and uncomfortable recognition, the face of a man who has been told the same story enough times that he's started to believe it without realizing that's what's been happening to him. "Dad," Daniel said carefully, "maybe we should talk to Dr. Marsh about—" "There is nothing wrong with my memory," I said with more sharpness than I intended. "And I did not put those keys in the refrigerator." Serena pressed her lips together, in that way she had not disagreeing, just enduring, and that expression made me angrier than anything she could have said out loud. Because it was designed to. Because it told everyone in the room that I was the one who wasn't thinking clearly without her having to say a word. That was how she built it. Not with one big lie, but with 100 small ones. A rescheduled doctor's appointment. I supposedly forgot, except I'd never been told it was rescheduled. A neighbor's voicemail I supposedly left at 2 in the morning, incoherent and confused, except I'd been sound asleep, and the voicemail had been sent from my phone by the same thumb that had learned to unlock it on a Sunday afternoon. She even got the stove. A burner left on discovered by Daniel when he came down for water at midnight. I had not cooked anything that evening. But the burner was on and I was the only other adult in the house, and Daniel looked at me across the kitchen with that same unbearable mixture of love and worry that a son gets when he's started to grieve someone who is still standing in front of him. "I know what's happening," I said out loud, to no one, to the cold December road and the bare oak trees and the distant halo of the Quick Mart sign. My breath came out in a ragged cloud, and I realized my voice had gone rough without my noticing. And then I thought about Daniel handing Serena that folder of old papers. His voice on the phone weeks ago. "Serena said she needs your signature on the car insurance renewal, Dad. I'll bring home whatever she needs for the paperwork." He'd meant it kindly. He was busy, she was handling household logistics. It seemed like the least complicated thing in the world. He had no idea she was sitting at the dining room table in the evenings with those signed pages and a good lamp and practicing. Getting the angle of my R right. Getting the downstroke of the C in Callaway to match what I'd produced in 1987 and what I produced now slightly different, slightly more compressed with age, and she'd noticed that had accounted for it. My son had handed her the pen. He hadn't known it. That didn't make it easier to carry. The pressure in my chest had moved by then from the center to the left, a slow lateral migration, that my body seemed to be making announcements about whether I wanted to listen or not. My left arm had developed a tingling that started at the shoulder and moved steadily toward the elbow like something being slowly turned off. I knew what that was. 22 years of being told what to watch for by Dr. Marsh had made sure I knew exactly what that combination of sensations meant. I spotted the bus stop bench about 30 yards ahead, a green metal bench with the County Transit logo on the backrest partially sheltered by a plexiglass panel on one side. I told myself I'd make it to the bench. Just the bench. I didn't think past that. I made it 14 steps further before my knees went sideways. I didn't fall dramatically. I didn't crumple or collapse the way people do in movies. I went down in stages the way an old structure goes, one support failing, then compensating, then the compensation failing too. I caught the bench with one hand, and then that arm gave out, and I went the rest of the way down to the asphalt on my side with a heaviness that I felt in my teeth. The cold of the road came through my flannel shirt immediately. My cheek was against the ground, and I could see the underside of the bench. From that angle, a stick of old gum on the metal strut, a smear of rust along the weld seam. I thought Lily is asleep right now. She doesn't know where I am. And then the world narrowed down to the effort of breathing, and I stopped thinking about anything at all. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for the cold to move through my shirt and start working on the skin beneath it. Long enough for the traffic sounds distant, sparse at this hour, to blur into something that felt less like the outside world and more like something playing at the edge of a dream. And then headlights swept across the road from behind me, and I heard the sound of a car slowing down. Then a door opening. Then footsteps on asphalt, quick and purposeful, the footsteps of someone who has already decided to stop rather than drive on. I'm going to tell you about Gloria Watkins the way she told it to me herself 3 days later in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee when she came to check on me and ended up staying 2 hours. I was sitting up by then, the bandage off my elbow, the IV out of my hand, and she sat in the chair beside the bed and told me everything I'd missed while I was unconscious on the side of that road. She said she almost didn't stop. Not because she didn't care, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to misunderstand. Gloria Watkins is not the kind of woman who drives past people in trouble. She's spent 55 years being precisely the opposite kind of woman. But it was past 10 o'clock on a December night. She'd just finished a 10-hour shift at the Sunrise Laundry on Antelope Road, and when her headlights picked up the dark shape on the shoulder near the bus stop, her first thought, honest as the day is long, she told me, was that it was a garbage bag someone had tossed from a moving car. And then I saw the shape of a hand, she said, leaning forward in the hospital chair, with her forearms on her knees. The way the fingers were spread out on the asphalt. And I thought, that's not a bag. That's a person. She pulled over before she'd finished the thought. That's the kind of woman she is. She called 911 before she got out of the car because she told me a nurse friend had once given her that advice years ago and it had stuck secure. The help first, then go in. She kept the dispatcher on the line while she crossed to where I was lying, and she said her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, because from the way I was positioned on my side, not moving one arm out, she couldn't tell if I was breathing. I kept talking to the dispatcher, she said, and I kept saying, he's not responding. I don't know if he's conscious. Please hurry. And then I got close enough to hear you breathing, and I almost started crying right there on the road. She crouched down beside me and did 3 things simultaneously. Continued talking to the dispatcher, put her hand on my shoulder to let me know someone was there, and scanned the area around me for anything that might explain what had happened. No car, no other people, no obvious injury, no blood. Just an old man in a flannel shirt and house slippers on a December road with no coat, no phone, and no ID visible. She went back to her car for the emergency blanket she kept in the trunk. She told me she'd carried that blanket for 11 years since her mother had a fall one winter and spent 40 minutes on a cold driveway before the ambulance arrived. She'd never used it before that night. She wrapped it around me and she talked to me the whole time. I want you to understand what that means. I was unconscious. I couldn't respond. I couldn't acknowledge her, and she talked to me anyway. Not panicked, not performative, just steady. You're not alone out here, she told me. Help is coming. Stay with me, sir. I've got you. She said at one point. I opened my eyes. Just for a second, she described it as a person surfacing briefly from deep water there, and then gone. She said she leaned closer and said, I'm right here. Don't worry. You're going to be okay. And she believed it when she said it, which I think is the reason it reached me even through the dark. While she was waiting for the ambulance, she found the card. It had slipped halfway out of my breast pocket when I went down a small laminated card, the size of a business card, that I'd made for myself 2 years ago after Dr. Marsh started talking about the importance of emergency contacts for people living alone. On one side, my name, my blood type, my medications, my primary physician. On the other side, one phone number labeled in my own handwriting, Daniel, son. Gloria held that card in her hand and memorized the number. She said later she had the strangest feeling about it, like she recognized the name from somewhere, but she couldn't place it in the moment and didn't try. She had more important things to focus on. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes after her call. Two paramedics, a gurney equipment, she didn't know the names of, but watched them use with the focused efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times. They worked on me right there on the road, while she stood back and gave them space and answered their questions. How long had she found me? Had I said anything? Had she seen anyone else nearby? She rode with me as far as the ambulance bay at Mercy General, because the paramedic asked if she was family, and she said no, just the person who found him, and they thanked her and took me inside and the doors closed, and she was standing alone in the ambulance bay in the cold, with her emergency blanket gone, and her shift clothes still smelling like laundry detergent. She called Daniel's number from the parking lot. No answer. She left no message because she didn't know what to say in a voicemail, and she figured the hospital would call. She drove home. She couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, she was still awake at her kitchen table when it came to her. Calloway. She'd seen that name before on a rejection letter. 4 months ago, she'd applied for a facilities coordinator position at a mid-sized construction management firm in Roseville, the kind of steady indoor work she'd been looking for since her knees started making the laundry job harder than it used to be. The rejection had been polite and impersonal, and signed by the hiring manager. The company name at the top of the letterhead was Calloway Building Solutions. She sat with that information for a long time at her kitchen table. Then she said out loud to her empty kitchen, she told me this and laughed a little, that short, dry laugh of a person who has learned to find the absurdity in hard things. Well, I guess things work out the way they're supposed to. I didn't know any of this when I woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't know her name. I didn't know what she'd done or how long she'd stayed or what she'd said to me in the dark. All I knew was that I was alive and that someone had made that possible. When she walked into my hospital room 3 days later with a card from her daughter and a small container of homemade soup, she said she wasn't sure the nurses would let through. I looked at her face and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. "You stopped," I said. "Of course I stopped," she said like it was the simplest thing in the world. Some of the most important things in a person's life hinge on a split-second decision made by a stranger on a dark road. I had done nothing to deserve Gloria Watkins. I had not earned her kindness. She gave it to me anyway, freely, the way good people give things without keeping score. 3 hours after she made that call, a phone rang in my son's kitchen. And the voice on the other end of that line was about to change everything Daniel thought he understood about the night he'd just lived through. Before I tell you what happened when that phone rang in Daniel's kitchen, I need to know you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That's all. Just a 9 so I know you're here and you haven't looked away yet. A quick note. This story contains some fictional elements woven in for depth and reflection. If that's not something you're comfortable with, this is a natural place to step away, no judgment at all. But if you're staying, what comes next will make everything that happened so far make sense. Daniel told me afterward what that night looked like from inside the house. He told me at the hospital 2 days later, sitting in the chair beside my bed, with his elbows on his knees and his voice going rough in places he was trying to keep smooth. I'm going to tell it to you the way he told it to me because he was the one who was there, and because what happened in that kitchen is part of this story, whether I witnessed it or not. He said he hadn't been able to sit down since I left. He'd tried. He'd stood at the kitchen counter for a while, then moved to the living room, then back to the kitchen, circling the house the way a man circles a problem he can't solve and can't walk away from. The folder Serena had laid on the dinner table was still there. She'd cleared the dishes around it, but left it in place like a centerpiece. Daniel said he'd looked at it a dozen times and hadn't touched it. Part of him wanted to open it again. Part of him didn't want to know what he'd find if he looked more carefully. Serena had gone upstairs around 11, saying she was exhausted and that he should try to get some sleep. He'd heard her moving around up there, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the bathroom faucet running, then quiet. He stood in the kitchen in the dark with the overhead light off, and only the range hood light on that dim amber glow that makes a kitchen feel like a confessional, and he stared at his own hands on the counter. His phone screen lit up at 12:47 in the morning. He told me his first thought before he even reached for it, before he saw the number, was that it was me, that I'd found a phone somewhere, a neighbor's landline or a gas station payphone, and I was calling to say I was sorry or to say he was wrong, or maybe just to say I was somewhere warm and he didn't need to worry. He reached for that phone with something shamefully close to hope, he said. His hand was shaking. The number was one he didn't recognize. Mr. Calloway. The voice was professional, measured a woman's voice with the particular steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information without letting emotion color the delivery. My name is Officer Patricia Okafor with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. Are you Daniel Calloway? Daniel said, his throat closed. Yes, he managed. Your father, Raymond Calloway, was brought into Mercy General Hospital earlier this evening. He was found unresponsive and is currently receiving treatment. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible. Daniel said he stood completely still for 3 full seconds, which felt like 3 full minutes. Then he shouted for Serena so loudly that Lily came to the top of the stairs, before Serena did, peering down with wide, dark eyes and a face pale with alarm. Go back to your room, sweetheart, Daniel told her. His voice cracked on the last word. Everything's okay. Go back to bed. Lily looked at him the way she sometimes does, like she knows more than she's saying, and is deciding whether it's safe to say it. Then she went back to her room, and Daniel heard her door close softly. Serena came into the kitchen in her robe hair down, squinting against the light Daniel had switched on. He told her what Officer Okafor had said, his father, the hospital come now. He was already reaching for his jacket. What Serena said next stopped him mid-motion. Daniel. Her voice was calm. Not concerned calm, not trying to stay steady calm. Just calm the way a room is calm when nobody's in it. He's doing this on purpose. Daniel turned to look at his wife. He wants you to feel guilty. Serena continued, folding her arms across her chest. He knows exactly what he's doing. You show up there tonight and he gets exactly what he wanted, you running to him, forgetting everything that folder showed us. Serena, Daniel said slowly, the man is in the hospital. He walked out of here with nowhere to go. Her voice sharpened just slightly, just enough that Daniel noticed. He probably sat down somewhere cold and waited for someone to call an ambulance. He's been managing you your entire life, Daniel. This is just one more way to do it. Daniel told me he stood there looking at his wife, and something in his chest hurt, in a way that was different from the hurt of the past few hours, sharper, more specific, like pressure on a bruise he hadn't known was there. How do you know he was outside? He asked. Serena blinked. What? Officer Okafor said he was found unresponsive. Daniel's voice was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that isn't calm, but is working hard to sound like it. She said he's at Mercy General. She didn't say where they found him. She didn't say he was outside. Serena's lips parted. For 1/2 second, Daniel said it was the smallest window he'd ever seen into something he hadn't wanted to look at. Her face did something uncontrolled. A flicker. A recalibration. There and gone in less time than it takes to blink. I just assumed, she said. He left on foot, so obviously. She didn't say that, Serena. Daniel picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. His movements were deliberate now, the deliberateness of someone being careful not to do anything they can't take back. I'll call you when I know more. She called after him as he went through the door, something about lawyers and waiting until morning, and how he was making a mistake, but... Daniel said her voice faded behind him. The moment he stepped into the cold air like a radio station losing its signal as you drive out of range. He sat in the driveway for a moment before starting the engine. Then he called Officer Okafor back on the number she'd called from. She answered on the second ring. "Officer Okafor," he said, "when you called me earlier, did you give my wife any details about where my father was found? About the circumstances?" There was a brief pause on her end. "Professional. Assessing." "Mr. Calloway, I called your number only. I haven't spoken to anyone else in your household." Daniel said the road in front of him went blurry for a second. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands to keep them steady. "I'm on my way to Mercy General," he said. "I'll be here," Officer Okafor said. And then carefully, "Drive safe, Mr. Calloway, and take your time. Your father is stable." Daniel pulled out of the driveway. He told me later that he drove the entire 12 minutes to the hospital without turning on the radio, without calling anyone, without doing anything except keeping his hands on the wheel and letting the question he didn't want to ask himself settle down into the place where he'd have to eventually face it. How did she know he was outside? The first thing I remember clearly is the light. Not the warm light of the house I'd built, or the amber glow of a kitchen at midnight, or even the orange blur of the Quick Mart sign fading at the edge of my vision. This was fluorescent light, the particular white-blue of hospital ceilings that makes every surface look like it's been cleaned very recently and might never have been warm in its entire existence. It hummed faintly. I stared at it for what felt like a long time before I understood what I was looking at. Then I heard the monitor. A steady metronomic beep that took me a moment to identify as my own heartbeat externalized, made into something you could count. I counted 3 beats before I felt the IV line taped to the back of my left hand, 4 more before I registered the weight of a blanket that wasn't mine, 6 more before I managed to turn my head. White walls. Curtain tracks on the ceiling. A blood pressure cuff on my right arm inflating on its own automatic schedule. Through a narrow window in the door, I could see the movement of people in a lit corridor, shoes on linoleum, the hem of scrubs, someone pushing a cart past without looking in. I was at Mercy General. I was alive. Both of those facts required a moment of quiet acknowledgement. "Mr. Calloway." A woman's voice, professional and unhurried. I turned my head the other direction and found a doctor, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, a stethoscope around her neck, and a tablet in her hand. "I'm Dr. Anita Webb, attending physician tonight. You're at Mercy General Hospital. You came in just over an hour ago. How are you feeling?" "Like I spent time on a sidewalk," I said. My voice came out like gravel being dragged across sandpaper. "What time is it?" "A little after 1 in the morning." She came to stand beside the bed, tapped something on her tablet. "You had a cardiac event, Mr. Calloway. Mild to moderate, your heart went into a stress response likely triggered by a combination of cold exposure, physical exertion, and elevated cortisol from whatever happened tonight." She looked at me steadily. "Your primary physician is listed as Dr. Kevin Marsh at Sierra Vista. We've contacted his service. He'll be in touch in the morning." "I need someone to call Margaret Harlow," I said. "Meg Harlow. Her number is in my—" I stopped remembering. No phone, no wallet, nothing. "She's my attorney, Auburn, California. If you can get me a phone, I can give you her number from memory." Dr. Webb's expression didn't change, but something in it became more attentive, in the way a doctor's face does when a patient starts making legally specific requests within 2 minutes of regaining consciousness. She handed me a phone without comment. I dialed Meg's number from 30 years of muscle memory, and she picked up on the 4th ring with the voice of a woman who sleeps lightly and keeps her phone on the nightstand. "Meg," I said. "It's Ray. I'm at Mercy General. I need you here." "I'm leaving now," she said. No questions. 15 years of working together, and she knew the difference between a call that needed explanation and a call that needed action. That was one of the latter. Dr. Webb had stepped out briefly and returned with a second person, a woman in her late 40s, with close-cropped hair and a badge clipped to her jacket that identified her as Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. Her eyes were sharp and dark and measured everything in the room with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to miss things. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm Officer Patricia Okafor. I was the responding officer when the paramedics brought you in. I have a few questions when you're ready." "I'll answer what I can," I said, "but I'd prefer to wait for my attorney before I make any formal statement." Officer Okafor nodded without hesitation. "That's your right. I just want you to know we're here and we're listening when you're ready. That's how you know the difference between an officer looking for a quick close and one actually trying to find out what happened." She pulled a chair to the corner of the room and sat down with a notepad on her knee, patient as a woman who understood that the truth wasn't going anywhere. It was Dr. Webb who changed the temperature of the room. She came back with a printed sheet, a blood panel, I assumed, though I couldn't read it from where I lay. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me with the careful, measured expression of a physician who is about to say something she wants to get exactly right. "Mr. Calloway, your cardiac event tonight was consistent with stress and cold exposure. But your blood work shows something that isn't explained by tonight alone." She paused. "The level of metoprolol succinate in your system is significantly below therapeutic range, not borderline significantly. For someone who's been taking this medication consistently for over 2 decades, we'd expect a steady plasma concentration. What we're seeing suggests your system hasn't had adequate medication for at minimum a week, possibly longer." Every sound in the room became very clear in that moment. The monitor beeping, the hum of the fluorescent light, Officer Okafor's pen, which had stopped moving. "I take that medication every morning," I said. "I have not missed a day in 22 years. "I believe you," Dr. Webb said. And she said it in a way that meant she was already asking the next question in her head, the one that followed from believing me. "Then something interfered with the medication itself," I said. "Someone replaced the tablets." Officer Okafor leaned forward in her chair. Not dramatically, just forward, the small physical expression of a mind sharpening onto something. "Mr. Calloway," Dr. Webb said carefully, "is there anyone in your household who might have had access to your medication?" Before I could answer, the door to my room opened. Daniel stood in the doorway. He was still in his jacket, his hair unsettled from the drive, his eyes moving quickly around the room, and landing on me with an expression that I had to look away from for a second, because the rawness in it was more than I was ready to take head on. He looked at the IV in my hand. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the damp, ruined house slippers still on my feet because no one had thought to remove them, sitting there on the blanket, like evidence of exactly what kind of night this had been. And something in his face buckled, not broke, not collapsed, but buckled the way good wood does under too much pressure, bending before it breaks. "Dad," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You came," I told him. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stood beside the bed and opened his mouth to say something. I could see him searching for the words, could see them failing him one by one until finally what came out was just, "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. Dr. Webb cleared her throat gently and looked at Daniel. "Mr. Calloway, I was just asking your father about access to his heart medication at home. Whether anyone else might have handled his prescriptions recently." Daniel looked at the doctor. Then he looked at me. I watched the question move through his face like weather moving across a hillside, visible at a distance, then closer, then overhead. "Why?" he asked. though I could see from his eyes that some part of him had already started to understand why. Some part of him had been understanding slowly and against everything he wanted to believe since the moment in the kitchen when his wife knew something Officer Okafor had never said. His hands, I noticed, were trembling. I was lying very still with my eyes half closed when Daniel's phone buzzed. He'd been standing at the foot of my bed, one hand wrapped around the bed rail, looking at the floor, with the expression of a man who had too many questions and wasn't sure which one to ask first. Then the buzz, once, twice a short pattern that meant a voice message rather than a call. He looked down at the screen. Something crossed his face that I couldn't fully read from where I lay, surprise, then a kind of arrested stillness, like a man who has just heard a sound he wasn't expecting in a room he thought was empty. He looked up at me. I had closed my eyes the rest of the way by then, not because I was asleep, but because I understood instinctively the way you understand things after 68 years of reading people, that whatever was on that phone was something Daniel needed to hear alone first. Some things have to land before they can be shared. He excused himself quietly and stepped out into the hallway. I lay there with the monitor beeping its steady rhythm above my head, and I listened. Not to words, I couldn't hear words through a hospital door pushed mostly shut. What I heard was the quality of the silence on the other side of it. The particular silence of a person standing completely still. Then a sound I hadn't heard from my son since he was 9 years old and broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in our backyard. A sharp, involuntary exhale, the kind that comes out of a person before they can stop it, when something hits them somewhere they hadn't thought to protect. Then nothing for a long time. Then the sound of him sliding down the wall. The soft, unmistakable sound of a grown man sitting on a hallway floor. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. I pressed my lips together and stared at the ceiling and told myself this was not the moment to fall apart, because I was the one in the hospital bed with an IV in my hand, and I needed to hold myself together for what came next. But hearing my son collapse in a hallway, even partially, even quietly, was a different kind of pain than anything the December cold or the cardiac event had done to me. That pain came from somewhere that no blood test could measure. After a long while, the door opened and Daniel came back in. He didn't go back to the foot of the bed. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room, the one Officer Okafor had vacated when she stepped out to make a call, and he dragged it to the side of my bed and sat down in it heavily the way a much older man sits. His eyes were red-rimmed and wet at the corners, and he wasn't trying to hide it anymore. "Dad," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Are you awake?" I opened my eyes. He was holding his phone in both hands, turning it over and over, the way you'd hold something fragile you were afraid of dropping. He looked at me for a moment, just looked, taking inventory, the way he had when he'd first walked in, like he was still reassuring himself. I was actually there, and then he said, "Lily sent me something." He held the phone out to me. I took it with my free hand, the one without the IV line, and I looked at the screen. The voice memo app was open. The timestamp showed it had been sent 40 minutes ago, while Daniel had been driving to the hospital, while I had been unconscious, while the house on the hill east of Sacramento had been quiet with my granddaughter inside it. I pressed play. Her voice came through the small speaker barely above a whisper, the way children whisper when they're genuinely afraid of being heard. Not the theatrical whisper of a game, but the real thing, breath, careful and close to the microphone. "Daddy." A pause. I could hear her breathing quick, shallow, scared. "I know you're at the hospital. I heard Officer Okafor on the phone when she called. I need to tell you something, and I don't know if I should, but I think I have to." Another pause longer. The sound of her swallowing. "Grandpa didn't take the money. He didn't. I heard Mom on the phone 2 weeks ago in the kitchen when she thought I was upstairs doing homework. She was talking to someone, and she said, her voice wavered, held. A 12-year-old girl holding herself together with both hands. She said once Grandpa was gone for a few days, everything would be finished, and the house would be, I couldn't hear the rest, because she went into the pantry. The recording went quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I recorded it because I was scared. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner, Daddy. I'm sorry. The recording ended. The timestamp read 14 seconds of silence at the end, before Lily had finally found the courage to stop it. I handed the phone back to Daniel. My hand was trembling, not from weakness, not from the cardiac event, but from something that moved through me with the force of something I hadn't let myself feel since I'd walked out that front door. The image of Lily at her kitchen table homework, spread in front of her, holding her phone under the table, and recording what she was hearing because she was frightened and didn't know what else to do, that image hit me somewhere behind the sternum, in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. My eyes were burning so badly, I had to look up at the ceiling to keep them from spilling over. 68 years old, a man who built things with his hands, lying in a hospital bed, blinking at fluorescent lights because a 12-year-old girl had been braver than any adult in that house. She recorded it because she was scared. Daniel said, his voice cracking wide open, now no more trying to hold it smooth. She's been scared, Dad. She's been scared this whole time, and she didn't know how to tell me. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye, rough and quick, the gesture of a man who is angry at himself for crying, but can't stop. What kind of father doesn't see that? The kind who was also being deceived. I told him. I kept my voice steady because one of us had to. Daniel, look at me. He looked up, eyes wet and jaw tight. She's 12 years old, and she stood up when the adults around her couldn't, I said. She did that. Whatever else happened in that house, she did that. And we are going to make sure she knows it mattered. Daniel pressed his lips together hard. His shoulders shook once, just once, and then he got himself back under control with the concentrated effort of someone lifting something very heavy. How long have you known? He asked. About Serena. About all of it. I took a breath to answer him. The door opened. Margaret Harlow walked in the way she always walks into a room that needs her, without hurry, without fanfare, with the particular self-possession of a woman who has spent 30 years being the calmest person in difficult situations because someone had to be. She was wearing a gray coat over what were clearly pajamas, her silver hair not fully combed, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and something else in the other, something wooden compact about the size of a shoebox. She looked at me. She looked at Daniel. She set the briefcase on the chair and held up what she was carrying in her other hand so I could see it clearly. The music box. The one I'd built for Margaret out of oak and walnut, with the hidden compartment that only one person in the world knew how to open. I believe, Meg said, in the precise, unhurried tone she reserved for moments when precision mattered most, that we have quite a lot to talk about. Meg doesn't waste time on preamble. In 30 years of working together, I have never once heard her open with pleasantries when the situation didn't call for them, and a hospital room at 2:30 in the morning with a client in a bed and a police officer in the corner was emphatically a situation that did not call for them. She set the briefcase down on the rolling table at the foot of my bed and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had organized its contents in the car on the way over. Officer Okafor had come back into the room quietly and returned to her chair, notepad, ready with the professional stillness of someone who has learned that the best thing an investigator can do sometimes is stay out of the way and let the truth arrange itself. "How are you feeling?" Meg asked me. "Considerably better than I was 2 hours ago," I said. "Good." She pulled out the first document and set it on the rolling table where both Daniel and I could see it. "Then let's begin." The first document was a printout of the pending transfer request, the one I'd found on a Wednesday morning 3 days ago, the one that had sent me to First Valley Bank before it opened. Meg walked through it methodically, the way she walked juries through evidence starting at the foundation, never assuming the person across from her already understood something she hadn't yet explained. "This transfer request was initiated from a tablet registered to Ray," Meg said, looking at Daniel directly. "The device in question is the older iPad that sits in the living room. Anyone with access to the house could use it." She tapped the document. "But the more significant detail is here, the verification code, the one-time confirmation the bank sends before processing a large transfer was rerouted. Instead of going to Ray's registered cell phone, it was set to deliver to a prepaid number." She pulled out a second sheet. "This number." Daniel leaned forward and looked at the number. "That prepaid phone was purchased at a convenience store on Winding Creek Road in Roseville," Meg continued. "Paid for in cash. No ID required. However, the store has a security camera at the register." She set down a printed still frame, grainy, taken from an overhead angle but clear enough. "That camera recorded the purchase." Officer Okafor leaned forward in her chair. She looked at the image for a long moment, then wrote something in her notepad without commenting. "The transfer never went through," Meg continued. "The account was flagged and frozen 3 days ago at the request of the account holder." She looked at me. "Your father went to the bank the morning he found this request and asked them to freeze all outgoing transactions and document the suspicious activity through their fraud division. The money is entirely intact." Daniel turned and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years. Not the raw grief of earlier, not the anger of the dinner table, but something quieter and more complicated. The look of a son realizing he had fundamentally misjudged the situation he thought he understood. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," I told him. "I wanted to confirm before I accused anyone of anything." Meg was already moving to the next document. She reached into the briefcase and brought out a small, clear sleeve containing what looked like ordinary pieces of paper. Old forms, insurance documents by the look of them, with typed lines and blank signature spaces. She set them on the table. "These are documents you provided to your wife for various household purposes over the past several months," Meg said to Daniel. "Car insurance renewal, home maintenance warranty registration, a utility account update." Daniel looked at them. I watched him recognize them, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his jaw shifted. "On each of these," Meg said, "your father's signature appears, and at the top of each one in the margin," she pointed to the handwritten note at the upper corner, "there's a notation in your handwriting. A reminder to yourself about what the form was for." Daniel picked up the first sheet. His own handwriting looked back at him for Serena Car insurance renewal. He set it down and picked up the second. For Serena warranty paperwork. His hand was trembling so visibly now that the paper shook. "These documents were used as practice material," Meg said. Her voice was level factual without accusation or theater. "For replicating Ray's signature. We've had a forensic document examiner compare the signatures on these forms to those appearing on 3 separate fraudulent documents, and the consistency is significant." Daniel set the papers down. He pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Then he said, in a voice that barely made it out of his throat, I handed her the pen. "You didn't know," I said. He looked up at me, eyes, glassy jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working beneath the skin. "That doesn't make it better, Dad." "No," I agreed. It doesn't, but it makes it different. But Okafor was writing steadily now, her pen moving in the focused, continuous way of someone capturing things they don't want to miss. Meg reached into the briefcase one more time and produced a single printed sheet, which she set on the table between us all with the same measured calm she'd maintained throughout, though I noticed that this time she set it face down first and then turned it over a small tell in a woman who didn't usually have tells, that what was on this particular page was the kind of thing that warranted a half-second of preparation before it was seen. It was an email, printed from a screenshot I'd taken weeks ago from the shared family email account I'd set up when Daniel first moved in, the one Serena hadn't thought to remove herself from, because she'd been using it for grocery lists and school communications, and hadn't considered that I might occasionally check it too, being the account holder. The email was addressed to a name neither Daniel nor Okafor had heard yet, Victor Pruitt. Daniel read it. I watched the blood drain from his face in a slow, terrible progression, starting at his forehead and moving downward, the way color leaves a building when all the lights go out, floor by floor. The email read in Serena's precise, business-like prose, Victor timeline is confirmed. The problem needs to be relocated before end of month. Once he's placed, the house goes on the market. I'll have the signed authorization within 2 weeks of placement. Proceed with the lender contact as discussed. The problem, Daniel said. His voice had gone hollow, the voice of someone speaking from a very great distance from themselves. She called him, she called you. He couldn't finish the sentence. His throat had closed on it. She called me the problem that needed to be relocated, I said quietly, before the end of the month. Okafor set her pen down for the first time. She looked at the email. She looked at me. Mr. Calloway, she said, who is Victor Pruitt? That, I said, is what I'd like to know officially, but I have a reasonable idea. I looked at Meg, who gave a small nod. However, before we go any further, there are some additional documents I'd like to introduce, and they're not in that briefcase. Okafor picked her pen back up. Where are they? I looked at the music box sitting on the chair where Meg had placed it. The oak and walnut surface caught the fluorescent light the same way it caught the morning light in my garage, the same warm grain I'd spent 3 evenings getting exactly right. In there, I said, I'll show you how to open it. There are things you build with your hands because someone needs them. A cabinet, a porch, a door that hangs perfectly level. And then there are things you build because someone you love is running out of time, and the only language you've ever been fluent in is wood and joinery and the patience of making something that will outlast the moment it was made for. I built the music box for Margaret in the spring of her last good year. She'd asked me once, years earlier, whether I could make a music box the way the old ones worked. Not electronic, not battery-powered, but a proper mechanical movement, the kind with a cylinder and steel comb that produced sound the way a craftsman's instinct tells him. Things should be produced through contact, through precision, through the irreplaceable physics of one carefully shaped thing striking another. I'd told her I'd get around to it. That was the kind of promise I made in my 50s that I kept in my mid-60s when I finally understood that getting around to things was not a guarantee the universe extended to everyone indefinitely. I used oak for the body and walnut for the inlay panels. I spent 3 evenings on the dovetail joints alone because Margaret had a particular appreciation for joints done right, the kind you can feel with your thumb and feel no seam in. The mechanical movement came from a specialty supplier in Vermont, a company that still made the components by hand, which appealed to me in the same way good lumber appeals to me because the patience required to make it right is embedded in the thing itself. The hidden compartment I designed myself. It's not complicated. Good hidden things rarely are. The music box sits on 4 small feet, and the interior base appears solid. What it actually contains is a shallow drawer no more than 3/4 of an inch deep, accessible only through a pressure latch concealed beneath the third pin of the musical cylinder. When the box is playing and you press down firmly on the third note position, while the cylinder is turning, a small catch releases and the bass panel tilts forward on a hinge no wider than a thumbnail. The whole mechanism fits inside a space most people wouldn't think twice about. Margaret was the only other person who knew it existed. She'd watched me install the latch one afternoon and said without missing a beat, "You built a safe inside a lullaby." "I built a door," I told her, "in case it's ever needed." She'd laughed that quiet, particular laugh she had when something struck her as both funny and exactly right, and said, "Raymond, you always know where to hide the important things." I pressed the third note in that hospital room with Officer Okafor, leaning forward in her chair, and Daniel standing at the foot of my bed, with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set tight. The cylinder turned, the latch released, the base panel tilted forward. Inside, a folded set of bank statement photocopies, a small memory card, no larger than a fingernail, removed from the secondary camera I'd installed in the garage 3 weeks prior. A handwritten list of dates and observations regarding my medication. What I'd taken, what I'd found in the bottle afterward, the discrepancy in weight and texture I'd documented with a kitchen scale I'd bought for the purpose, and 3 photographs I'd taken of documents I found in Serena's tote bag one afternoon while she was in the backyard, and the bag was sitting open on the kitchen table. I'm not proud of going through her bag. I want to be honest about that. But I'm also not apologetic about it. A man has a right to protect what he's built. Meg took the memory card immediately and set it beside her laptop. Okafor photographed the contents of the compartment before anyone touched anything else, efficient and thorough. The kind of professional composure that comes from having done this enough times to have developed a system. "The camera in the garage," Okafor said, looking at me. "Is it still active?" "I deactivated the main system when Daniel and Serena moved in," I said. Privacy seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I paused. "But I kept a secondary account on the backup system. A login Serena doesn't know exists. I reactivated it tonight from the phone Meg lent me about 20 minutes after she arrived." Okafor looked at me steadily. "So the camera at your residence is currently recording?" "It is," I said. "Whatever's happening in that house right now is on footage." Something shifted in Okafor's posture, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the forward tilt of a person whose sense of urgency has just recalibrated. She stepped away from the bed and made a call, her voice low and authoritative, requesting a unit to my address to secure the property and protect potential evidence on site. Daniel had been quiet through most of this. He'd watched Meg extract the contents of the compartment, watched Okafor photograph them, watched me explain each piece in the measured tone I'd been using since I woke up in this bed. The tone of a man who prepared for this, who is not surprised by any of it, who built this moment as carefully as he'd built the compartment that held the evidence for it. Now he looked at the empty music box sitting open on the hospital tray, the little steel comb still visible inside, and said quietly, "Mom would have had something to say about all of this." My throat tightened. "She did," I said. "Just not in the way you'd expect. She told me I always knew where to hide the important things." I let that sit for a moment. I think she meant it about more than woodworking. Daniel's eyes went bright and wet at the corners. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a second, the particular look of a person refusing to cry in a room full of people and almost succeeding. Okafor came back to the bedside. "We have a unit en route to the property," she said. "Mr. Calloway, I want to make sure we can access the footage remotely. Can you walk me through the login?" "I can," I said. "But first there's one more thing." I looked at Daniel. He met my eyes. I could see him steeling himself the way he used to steel himself as a boy before something he knew was going to hurt. There's something I need to tell you about the house, about what your mother left behind. I paused. Not tonight. There's too much happening right now. But before this night is over, you need to hear it. Daniel nodded slowly. His voice when he spoke was barely above a murmur. Is it good or bad? I thought about that for a moment. About Margaret and the paperwork she'd asked Meg to draw up in her last clear-headed month, and the reason she'd given for it that I hadn't fully understood until tonight. It's true, I said, which sometimes feels like both at once. Okafor's radio crackled. She pressed it to her ear, listened, and her expression changed in a way that made the temperature in the room drop 2 degrees. What I'm about to tell you, I did not see with my own eyes. I want to be clear about that from the start. I was in a hospital bed at Mercy General when all of this happened. What I know comes from 2 sources: the footage from the secondary camera I reactivated that night using the backup login on my phone, and the detailed report Officer Okafor gave me later, sitting in that same hospital room, with her notepad open, and her voice steady and careful, in the way it gets when she's presenting facts. She wants you to understand completely before you react to them. I'll tell you what the camera saw. I'll tell you what the police found when they arrived. And I'll tell you about the moment I heard it all lying in a hospital bed with my son beside me, understanding for the first time the full size of what Serena had been prepared to do. At some point after 3 in the morning, the camera in my garage recorded Serena coming downstairs. She moved through the living room quickly, not turning on lights, navigating the house in the dark, the way someone does when they know a floor plan by heart and don't want to be visible from the windows. She went to the kitchen first. She stood at the counter for several minutes with her phone to her ear, her body angled away from the camera's line of sight, her voice too low to capture clearly. Okafor told me later the call was traced to Victor Pruitt's prepaid line. Whatever he said to her, it was short and final sounding, because when she lowered the phone, her posture changed, the particular change of a person who has just run out of options and knows it. She went upstairs. She came back down 12 minutes later carrying a soft-sided travel bag. My camera doesn't reach the upstairs bedrooms, so I couldn't see what she packed. But when officers later searched the bag, they found $11,000 in cash. Her passport, a second passport, I didn't know she had under a different surname, Lily's social security card, and 3 of the forged documents she'd created using Daniel's collected signatures. She set the bag by the front door. Then she stood in the entryway for a long moment, with one hand on the strap, and I watched her on that footage with the particular ache of knowing what she was looking at, even though the camera couldn't see her face. She was looking toward the back of the house, toward the garage, toward the room where I kept 40 years of tools and lumber and projects in progress, and somewhere she believed was still in it, the music box she'd never been able to find. She left the bag where it was, turned around, walked toward the garage. What followed was the most methodical thing I've ever watched a person do in a state of desperation. She went through my workbench drawers first, pulling each one open and running her hands along the backs and undersides. She moved to the shelf above the bench and took down every box, every canister, every container, setting them on the floor and looking through each one. She pulled tools off the pegboard. She lifted the tarp on the half-finished cabinet I'd been building for the past month and looked beneath it. The music box wasn't there. Meg had walked out of my garage with it 45 minutes earlier, accompanied by a deputy who'd met her at the property. Serena understood what that meant. I could see it in the way she went still at the workbench, the same stillness I'd heard from Daniel in the hospital hallway. The stillness of a person absorbing something they were hoping they wouldn't have to absorb. Then she reached for the metal bin I kept near the workbench for scrap disposal. She started putting things into it, papers, folders, a small notebook. Documents she'd apparently stored somewhere in the garage that I hadn't known about. She moved to the shelf along the side wall and took down a plastic storage bin labeled holiday decorations, pulled off the lid, removed the documents hidden beneath the tissue paper inside. Then she went to the shelf near the garage door and lifted down the red gasoline can, the one I kept for the lawnmower, sitting where it always sat between the extension cord and the bag of mulch. The footage shows her pouring, measured. Not panicked, not reckless, measured the way she did everything right up until the end. The camera catches the small flash of silver in her right hand as she reached into her jacket pocket. That was when the red and blue lights came through the frosted glass panel of the garage door. She froze. The lighter was in her hand. The bin was soaked. And then, from somewhere in the interior of the house, there was the sound of a door opening. Small footsteps in the hallway. And Lily, 12 years old and barefoot, appeared in the doorway that connected the garage to the house. She was wearing the blue pajamas with the stars on them that I'd seen her in 100 times. Her hair was messy from sleep. Her eyes went from her mother to the metal bin, to the gasoline can, to the lighter, and I watched her face on that footage do something that broke something in me that I am still in the process of putting back together. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at her mother with the eyes of a child who understood exactly what she was seeing and had no more room left inside her for surprise. "Lily," Serena said. Her voice was strange, not commanding, not pleading, something caught between the two. "Go back upstairs." Lily didn't move. She stood in that doorway with her bare feet on the cold concrete and looked at her mother and didn't say a single word, and that wordlessness was the loudest thing in the room. The garage door rattled as the deputies knocked. Serena set the lighter down on the workbench. She stepped back from the bin. And whatever she'd been about to do, she didn't finish doing it. When Okafor called me to report what the camera had captured and what the officers had found, I listened to the whole account without speaking. Daniel was still in the room. He was watching my face and reading it the way children learn to read their parents' faces, long before they understand the words that go with the expressions. When Okafor finished, I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with cardiac muscle. It was the kind of hurt that lives further in than that the hurt of a man picturing his 12-year-old granddaughter barefoot in a cold garage looking at a woman holding a lighter over a metal bin soaked in gasoline and not running away. "Dad," Daniel's voice was rough. "What happened?" I told him. All of it. And when I got to the part about Lily in the doorway, Daniel pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, and his shoulders shook with something that wasn't quite crying, and wasn't quite not crying either. The sound he made was the sound of a Satan realizing, in full for the first time, exactly how much his daughter had been carrying alone. "She's safe," I said, because he needed to hear it first. "Serena was taken into custody. Lily is safe." Daniel nodded, hand still pressed to his mouth, working to hold himself together. I let him. Then I said, "There's still something we need to talk about the house and what your mother arranged before she died." I kept my voice steady because the night wasn't over yet, and there were things that still needed to be said clearly without the weight of all this pressing down on every word. Some of it is going to be hard to hear, but it changes everything about what Serena thought she was taking. Daniel lowered his hand. His eyes were red and wet, but focused, the look of a man who has decided that whatever is coming, he is going to face it without flinching. "Tell me," he said. I spent a moment choosing where to begin. Not because the facts were complicated. Meg had spent 15 years making sure my legal affairs were anything but because some truths carry more weight when you approach them from the right direction, and what I was about to tell my son had been sitting in a document for 3 years, waiting for exactly this kind of night. Your mother, I said, was smarter than either of us. She just didn't always make a point of announcing it. Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't ready to hear about Margaret in the past tense at 5 in the morning in a hospital room, but he held himself steady. What did she do? About a year before she died, she asked Meg to draw something up. I nodded toward Meg, who reached into the briefcase and produced a document. I recognized pale blue cover sheet, Meg's firm name at the top, Margaret's signature at the bottom, in the handwriting that got slightly more careful in her last months. The writing of someone who understood that certain signatures mattered more than others. A revocable living trust. She put the house in it. Daniel frowned. I thought the house was yours. I'm the trustee, I said. I manage it. I live in it. I have full authority over it during my lifetime. But I'm not the sole beneficiary. I let that land for a second. Your mother left a beneficial interest in the property to Lily. Not to you, to Lily. It takes effect when Lily turns 21 or earlier if certain conditions are met. Until then, I hold it in trust for her. The color left Daniel's face slowly like water draining from a basin. She built that into the document 3 years ago. Meg said, her voice measured and precise. Which means that even if Serena had somehow persuaded you to sign a sale agreement, and even if she had successfully obtained a fraudulent power of attorney for Ray, the transaction would have been legally void. You cannot sell a property with a minor beneficiary's interest attached without either court approval or the consent of the child's legal guardian, and in this case that guardian is Ray himself, not you, and certainly not Serena. Daniel put both hands on the edge of the hospital bed rail and gripped it. His knuckles went pale. Serena was trying to sell Lily's house, he said. Not a question. The voice of a man saying something out loud, because he needs to hear it in his own voice to fully believe it. She didn't know about the trust, I said. Or she knew and decided it wasn't an obstacle she couldn't work around. I'm genuinely not sure which of those possibilities disturbs me more. All of this? Daniel's voice cracked straight through the middle. Everything she did, the lies, the medication putting you out in the cold, and she couldn't even have sold it. It was never hers to take. She would have discovered that eventually, I said. But by then she'd have already done enough damage that the discovery wouldn't have mattered much. Meg reached into the briefcase one final time and produced 2 documents which she set on the hospital tray side by side. On the left, the email Serena had sent to Victor Pruitt, the one that called me the problem to be relocated before end of month. On the right, Margaret's trust document cover page, up her signature visible at the bottom. I looked at those 2 pieces of paper for a long moment. The handwriting of a woman who had spent her last clear months making sure the people she loved would be protected, placed directly beside the email of a woman who had spent 8 months trying to dismantle everything that protection was built to preserve. The music box was sitting on the chair beside the bed, its mechanical movement still running, the cylinder still turning. The notes it played were thin and delicate, in the fluorescent brightness of the hospital room, almost too quiet to hear. Margaret had loved that particular song because she said it sounded like the last of the afternoon light. The way it felt when the day was almost over, but not quite, when there was still just enough warmth left to be grateful for. I heard it, and my eyes burned so badly I had to press my fingers against them. Just for a second. Just enough. She knew, didn't she? Daniel said. His voice had gone soft and unsteady. She knew something like this could happen someday. Not Serena specifically, but something. Your mother knew that the people who love you most are sometimes the ones who forget to protect the foundation, I said. She just made sure someone did. Daniel pressed the back of his wrist against his mouth, and his shoulders moved once with something he was fighting hard not to let out fully. He stared at his mother's signature on that blue cover sheet, and I watched him grieve her all over again, in a way that was different from every other time he'd grieved her, because this time he understood something about her he hadn't understood before. Officer Okafor's phone buzzed against her palm. She looked at the screen, then at me. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "we found something else in the garage, beyond the documents and the gasoline." She paused in the way she paused when she was choosing her words carefully. Something we weren't expecting. Officer Okafor had a way of presenting facts that I'd come to trust completely. She never editorialized. She never nudged you toward a conclusion before you'd had time to reach it yourself. She laid everything out in sequence, methodical, level 1 verified fact placed carefully on top of another. What she spread before us in that hospital room at 5 in the morning was the full, unobstructed shape of something most of us had seen completely until that moment. In addition to the documents Serena was destroying, Okafor said, reading from her notepad with practiced calm, officers recovered a prepaid phone with recent calls to Victor Pruitt's number. They also found a printed folder left on the workbench, apparently overlooked, containing a list of 12 residential care facilities in Northern California. Each had handwritten notes: distance, monthly cost, availability. She looked up. "The one with a check mark is 42 miles from your house, Mr. Calloway. In Stockton." Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the December night I'd already survived. They also found printed emails from a secondary account opened 6 weeks ago under a variation of Serena's maiden name, Okafor continued. "The correspondence with Victor Pruitt predates her and Daniel moving into your home." Daniel exhaled sharply beside me, a man suddenly recalculating 8 months of his life. Okafor read from the earliest email. Serena's writing was clean and businesslike, someone who had long moved past the stage where any of this produced emotional turbulence. The plan had 4 stages: establish a convincing narrative of financial misconduct against Ray, remove Ray from the property, and cut off his communication before a bank freeze could be challenged, obtain financial power of attorney while Daniel remained distressed, then execute a fast property sale to satisfy the debt to Victor Pruitt, keeping whatever remained. The room went very quiet. Victor Pruitt, Okafor said, setting down her notepad, is not a licensed lender. He operates as a private asset recovery broker, locating distressed properties and facilitating rapid sales for a significant percentage. He's currently under investigation by the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation for 2 similar prior cases. She looked at Daniel. Your wife engaged his services 9 months ago after a private online business she'd never disclosed to you failed, leaving her approximately $214,000 in debt. Daniel's voice barely held together. She had a business I didn't know about. It operated for 14 months, Okafor said. She'd taken loans against personal assets, including a vehicle registered in your name as collateral. Daniel turned to the window. His profile in the pre-dawn light was the profile of a man being quietly disassembled and rebuilt, one fact at a time. She called him the problem to be relocated, Daniel said. Those exact words. Twice, Okafor confirmed. The phrasing was Pruitt's initially. She adopted it. I placed my hand on Daniel's arm. He didn't pull away. Outside, the sky was shifting from black to deep blue, what Margaret used to call the day clearing its throat before it spoke. Someone else knew what was happening to Ray's medication, Meg said carefully from across the room. She's been sitting in the hallway for the past 2 hours. My chest tightened, not with pain, but with something close to gratitude. Norma, I said. Meg nodded. Norma Briggs had been sitting in a plastic chair outside my room for 2 hours before anyone told me. Meg mentioned it quietly, the way you hold something back until the moment is right. 2 hours while Okafor laid out the 4-stage plan, while Daniel learned about Victor Pruitt, while the whole shape of the night was finally becoming visible. Norma had been 10 feet away, waiting. She came through the door, looking exactly like what she was, a 65-year-old woman who had driven herself to a hospital at 3 in the morning because she'd seen police lights at her neighbor's house and couldn't sit home pretending she didn't understand what they meant. Her tan coat was the one she wore every winter. Her hair wasn't fully combed. She gripped her phone with both hands to keep them from shaking visibly. "Norma," I said, "you didn't have to come." She looked at me, at the IV mark on my hand, at everything a hospital room at 6 in the morning communicates without words, and her eyes went red immediately. "I should have come a long time ago," she said, her voice cracking clean in half. She sat and told it straight. The morning at the kitchen window, the 2 bottles, Serena at the sink. How she'd told herself it could have been vitamins. How Serena had found her in the driveway that Tuesday, calm and precise, delivering a warning about a missing earring without ever making it sound like one. "She looked right at me," Norma said, jaw tight. "I knew exactly what she meant. And I went home and told myself I wasn't sure." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I knew what I'd seen." "Norma," I started. She shook her head hard, not ready for absolution. "You ended up on a sidewalk, Ray." A tear ran down her cheek, and she pressed her hand against it fiercely. "You could have—" "You're here now," I said. "That's what counts." She pulled up the photograph. Blurry, taken through glass, just the nervous reflex of a woman who couldn't stop herself from pressing the button. Serena's outline. 2 bottles on the counter. The motion of transfer caught mid-gesture. Okafor studied it carefully, photographed it with her own phone, and nodded. "Corroborating evidence," Okafor said. "Combined with the blood panel, this establishes deliberate interference." She looked at Norma. "I'll need a formal statement." "Whatever you need," Norma said, the steadiness of a woman finished second-guessing herself. When Meg took Norma for her statement and Okafor stepped out, the room went quiet. Just Daniel and me. "If there were nothing to inherit," I asked carefully, "would you still be sitting here?" He flinched, the flinch of a man feeling the full weight of a fair question. Then he stood, called Meg, and said, "I want to sign whatever removes me from any claim on my father's estate. Tonight. Before I leave this building." He lowered the phone and held what he'd just done without flinching. A man who had made a choice that cost him something real before he knew what he'd get in return. His phone buzzed. "Lily." He held it toward me. Her voice came through small and careful. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "Better than last night," I told her. "Are you okay? Is our house going to be okay?" Our house. 12 years old, and she already knew it was hers. My throat closed so fast I had to breathe through it. "Your house is fine, sweetheart," I said. "It always was." Weeks later, in a Sacramento courtroom, Serena looked at Daniel and said, "I did all of this to protect our family." His voice came out flat and final. "You called my father a problem to be relocated. That's not protection. That's disposal." She turned to me. "That house was supposed to belong to this family." "It does," I said. "It belongs to Lily. It always has." They released me on a Sunday morning, 2 days after the longest night of my life. I walked out through the sliding doors into a January sky, that particular clear blue of Northern California winter cold that doesn't apologize but doesn't try to hurt you. I stood on the sidewalk, hands in my jacket, took one long breath and thought, all right. Whatever comes next, I'm walking into it on my own 2 feet. Serena accepted a plea agreement in February. 4 years in a federal facility plus restitution. Victor Pruitt lost his license, 2 prior clients coming forward once his name was public. Lily's $120,000 was unfrozen, moved into a formal trust under Meg's management, protected by structures that would take far more than an ambitious daughter-in-law to penetrate. In March, I sat across from Meg and signed the paperwork to sell the house. "You don't have to," she said. She always states the alternative once clearly before accepting a client's decision. "I know," I said. "That's why I can." I had built that house for Margaret, and Margaret was gone. I didn't want to live where the sound of that deadbolt still lived in the walls. I found a place in Rockland near a public park, single-story, modest yard, a detached garage with good bones and bad lighting, which I fixed in the first 2 weeks. Before I moved, I found Gloria Watkins at the laundry on Antelope Road. She recognized me before I reached her, and her hand went to her mouth. "I need you to take this," I said, holding out an envelope. She looked at it without touching it. "I didn't stop for a reward." "I know you didn't. That's exactly why." She took it, hands trembling. "I just did what anyone should do," she said. "You'd be surprised," I told her, "how few people do." Daniel and I started meeting on Sundays, coffee drives, occasional projects at the new house. He joined a support group for families navigating addiction. He never asked me for anything from the estate. A man who keeps his word under pressure is someone you can build something new with. Lily came every Saturday, without exception. By the 3rd week, she was in the workshop beside me. I taught her how to read grain, how to feel a true joint with her thumb. "Why does it have to be perfect?" she asked one afternoon. "It doesn't have to be perfect," I told her. "It has to be honest. There's a difference." In September, Daniel stood in my doorway and said, "You could have kept the house, Dad. I built that house for Margaret," I said. "She's gone. This one I'm building for what comes next." Then I looked at him. "I forgive you because you're my son. But I can't build my life on the hands of someone who only believed me after the police called. We start from here, from what's true right now." He nodded and didn't ask for more, which was how I knew he understood. Now Lily appeared at the workshop window, cheeks flushed, waving with the unself-conscious joy of a child who hasn't yet learned to measure her happiness for an audience. I raised my hand and waved back. The box I'd been building her since September needed one more coat of oil. The lid still wanted sanding, but the frame was sound. The joinery held. Some things you build because someone needs them. Some things you build because you need to remember that you still can. I picked up the sandpaper and got back to work. If there's one thing this family story taught me, it's that the people who love us most are not always the ones who protect us best. Sometimes they're the ones who hand someone else the key, without knowing it, without meaning to, and call it trust. I spent 40 years building things meant to last, and I almost lost everything in a single night because I underestimated how quietly damage can be done by someone standing right next to the people you love. Don't wait the way I waited. Don't watch the warning signs and tell yourself it isn't your business. Don't assume the person beside you sees what you see. Speak up sooner. Ask the harder question earlier. The truth doesn't get easier to say the longer you hold it. It just gets heavier. I believe God put Gloria Watkins on that road at exactly that moment for a reason. Not because I deserved saving, but because Lily deserved a grandfather who lived long enough to teach her how to make a proper dovetail joint. Grace doesn't always arrive the way you expect it. Sometimes it drives a 10-year-old car and works the overnight shift at a laundromat. These grandpa stories don't always end neatly. This one didn't. But it ended honestly, and in my experience, that's the better outcome of the two. If this family story reached you somewhere real, I'd love to know. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, and if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one, share it with them. Stories like these find the people who need them most when we pass them along. Subscribe so you don't miss the next grandpa stories coming your way, because the ones ahead will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for staying until the very last word. It means more than you know. One final note. Some of the stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted with care for the purpose of emotional and moral reflection. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, we completely respect that. Please feel free to explore other channels that better suit what you need today. But if you're staying welcome, there's always another story worth telling.